revolutions in France in the 19th century, the Revolution of 1830, of 1848, and in its eventual outcome, also the upheavals associated with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 and the Paris Commune. And Marx is very explicit that these changes, however dramatic they are, leave the existing ruling class in place, and indeed their main effect, he says, is to perfect the capitalist state as an apparatus of bureaucratic power. Now, as I said, there have been many political revolutions in the history of capitalism. Particularly important from the perspective of our tradition, the international socialist tradition, are the revolutions in Eastern and Central Europe and in the Soviet Union between 1989 and 1991. We see those as political revolutions. In other words, we don't see the overthrow of the Stalinist regimes as representing a counter-revolution, the restoration of capitalism. On the contrary, they represent what the late Chris Harman called a move sideways. In other words, a move from one form of capitalism, the kind of bureaucratic state capitalism that prevailed in the Stalinist societies, to another form of capitalism, in other words, the kind of market capitalism that prevails in the West and which is now, to a greater extent than was true then, globally dominant. So these were very important political upheavals that represented a dramatic change in political regime, but that left the mode of production, the capitalist mode of production in place. Okay, what then, in comparison, is social revolution? A social revolution is a political transformation, and it's important to emphasize this, that involves a change in the mode of production. In other words, the critical difference between a political and a social revolution is that in the case of social revolution, the mode of production is changed. Examples of social revolutions: the great bourgeois revolutions, the Dutch revolt at the end of the 16th century, the Great English Revolution at the middle of the 17th century, the Great French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. Those all were revolutions that involved the overthrow of the existing regime, one form or other, of feudal absolutism, or would-be absolutism, and the installation of a state that represented the interests of capital and promoted the process of capital accumulation. So one important thing to note about social revolutions is that they involve politics. There's a famous definition of social history by the English historian G.M. Trevelyan, where he says social history is history with the politics left out. Well, social revolution isn't revolution with the politics left out. Critical in social revolutions is a change in state power driven by mass revolt from below, although the extent of the mass revolt varies according to the circumstances in the case of bourgeois revolutions. A political transformation that involves a change in the class nature of the state. The other example of social revolution that I want to mention is the Russian Revolution of October 1917. Here we have the case not of a bourgeois revolution that provides the political conditions for the dominance of capitalism. In this case, of course, we have the self-organized working class taking political power, with the aim, as Lenin put it, when the Soviet Republic was proclaimed, of proceeding to construct the socialist order. Now, it should be clear from what I've been saying that social revolutions are much rarer than political revolutions, and indeed the kind of social revolution that we want, namely a socialist revolution that overthrows capitalism, is much rarer than we would like, because of course the Russian Revolution, although it was a social revolution, was ultimately defeated. Okay, another thing to say about political and social revolutions is that the borderline between the two is blurred. So let's take one very important case of a revolution in the 20th century, the German Revolution of November 1918. This was what happened at the end of the First World War, as the German government was capitulating, acknowledging defeat against the Entente powers, the Western powers in the First World War, and you have a series of mutinies that starts in the German Navy, that spreads into the army, and that also leads to the development of large-scale strike action by workers. The effect of those revolts is to force about a change in political regime. The Kaiser, the German Emperor, Wilhelm II, is removed, and Germany becomes a republic. Now, in the medium term, the outcome of that revolutionary upheaval was the establishment of a bourgeois republic, the Weimar Republic, that is constitutionally established in 1919, but only really stabilizes in 1923. So this was a political revolution. It was a change of political regime within the framework of capitalism. But because of the role of workers, particularly threatening, linked up to soldiers and sailors in the process that brought down the Kaiser and forced the shift to Republican rule, the November Revolution in 1918 had the potential of becoming a social revolution. In other words, a socialist revolution. That didn't turn out. In the end, as I said, a degree of bourgeois stability was restored by the end of 1923, although why I talked about the medium term was that only proved to be temporary, and we have much more unpleasant things happening later on in the context of the Great Depression with the Nazis taking power. But nevertheless, the nature of the political revolution in that case opened up the prospect of workers taking power. And this wasn't just a formal possibility, this was a real danger. You have a series of struggles that go on till the autumn of 1923, in which the possibility of workers taking power and creating a German Soviet Republic to join the Russian Soviet Republic, that's all really on the cards until the ultimate defeat of the revolution. One thing, incidentally, that's worth noting about the German case is that it brings out that revolutions aren't just instantaneous moments. You know, it's not the people when they talk about the Russian Revolution of October 1917 talk about the storming of the Winter Palace. In other words, the moment, the relatively concentrated moment in which the provisional government was overthrown, that then allowed a Soviet Republic to be proclaimed, enabled the transfer of political power. Now that's a very important moment, but revolutions are in fact quite extended processes. What happens with revolutions is there's initial rupture, initial mass upheaval that partially breaks and disorganizes the existing structure of state power. And that opens a period of instability in which the forces of revolution, or radical revolution, and counter-revolution contend. And in the German case, it took nearly 5 years for the outcome to be determined. This is important to bear in mind when we think about the revolutions in the Arab world. What we've seen, these incredibly dramatic events of the past few months, represent the beginnings of much more protracted revolutionary processes in which revolution and counter-revolution will fight each other with an open outcome. Okay, so those are some general points about the distinction between political and social revolutions and so on, and something also about the nature of revolutionary processes. I'm sure that Colin Darker said much more about that in his meeting in this series, but it's important to underline that while they're particular decisive moments particularly the moments when the existing system of state power is at least partially broken, and the moment of the transfer of political power. In the case of Russia in 1917, the February Revolution that overthrows the Tsar, and the October Revolution that overthrows the provisional government and installs Soviet power. So there are decisive moments in which state power is up for grabs. Nevertheless, those moments are part of much more complex and protracted processes, which are, as Trotsky emphasizes at the beginning of his great history of the Russian Revolution, learning processes, in which, in particular, the masses, as he puts it, through a method of successive approximation, tries different political options, which may at the time seem like solutions to their problems, but turn out not to be. And in the case, for example, of the Great French Revolution and the Russian Revolution of 1917, the learning process leads to a greater radicalization of the masses and of the struggle, whose outcome is a decisive social revolution. Okay, but I want, as I said, I want to talk in particular about the kind of logic that develops in the context of global capitalism that tends to link together political and social revolutions. As I said, it's generally true. It's true when political revolutions involve mass mobilization from below, and particularly the mobilization of the working class, that there's a potential for the political revolution to become a social revolution. But there's also a particular logic that makes the move from political to social revolution more likely in certain contexts. And this is the logic of permanent revolution. It's not a universal logic, it's a logic that's operative primarily in what, in the language of orthodoxy, are called underdeveloped societies and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, because most of the world is, from the standpoint of the core advanced capitalist countries, underdeveloped, this logic is tremendous. And it's a logic that is a consequence of a universal process, which Trotsky calls uneven and combined development. What do I mean by that? Capitalism creates a single integrated world system. This is something that Trotsky insists on very strongly, that capitalism isn't just, when we talk about the capitalist world economy or capitalism as a global system, we don't just mean a collection of national economies that are pasted together. What we're talking about is an integrated global system of which the individual national economies are component parts. I mean, there's a lot of talk about globalization, so on and so forth, but this character of capitalism as a global system is something that has been true throughout its history. Marx says, contained in the concept of capital itself is the tendency to create a world market. Capitalism is of its nature, at least potentially, a global system. But the formation of this world system doesn't lead to a process of uniform development. Just because all the different economies are part of the same system doesn't mean that they're all at the same level of economic development or grow at the same pace. On the contrary, capitalist economies develop unevenly. That may seem kind of banal, uneven development, so what? But if you look actually more deeply into the process of capital accumulation, you'll see that what historically tends to happen is that the accumulation of capital involves the creation of regionally concentrated clusters of capital accumulation that represent the most powerful components of the system. So that a fairly obvious example is large parts of England and southern Scotland in the era of the Industrial Revolution. Here we have the creation of a highly concentrated cluster of industries that represent the most advanced that capitalism has to offer at the time, but that coexist with and depend upon all sorts of different forms of less advanced forms of economic development. So Marx in Capital talks about the way in which Britain in the 19th century, Ireland is transformed from a relatively robust peasant economy into an economy that acts partly as a labour reserve for British industry, Irish migrant workers going to work in the factories and construction industry and so on and so forth of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, but also into a supplier of food for the cities of Industrial Revolution Britain. So it's not just that you get the development of advanced clusters of capitalism, but these coexist with areas who are kept in a stage of relative backwardness and may indeed be forced backward, because their being in that kind of position serves the interest, serves the development of the concentrated cluster of capital accumulation. This goes on. I don't have time to illustrate it, but if we look, for example, at the development of capitalism in China over the last generation, it's enormously concentrated, particularly in southeast coastal China. When we talk about China's rise, it's not a rise of the 1.3 billion Chinese, it's a rise that is highly concentrated in certain areas that have been transformed, and the rest of the country, to a significant extent, feeds the development of these advanced centres. So the development is uneven, but the unevenness involves the coexistence of advanced clusters and backward regions that are interdependent in very profound ways. But it's also important to understand, and this is one of Trotsky's key insights, that within the so-called backward countries, you don't have uniform backwardness. You have, in fact, very complex combinations of advanced and backward. Much of the society in question may remain in often incredibly primitive and barbaric rural conditions as far as the mass of population is concerned. But you can get the emergence of nodes of advanced capitalism, often, again, as I'm suggesting, highly regionally concentrated. And there's a phrase by the German Marxist philosopher Ernst Bloch that sums up what this involves very well. He talks about the synchronicity of the non-synchronous. Actually, when I say the phrase, I realise that only a philosopher could think that this is a really good phrase. What it means is that you have the coexistence in real time within the same society of social forms that actually represent very different historical times. So to take the crucial case that Trotsky was interested in, by the beginning of the 20th century, you have clusters of relatively advanced capitalism taking advantage of the most advanced technologies available on a world scale, taking advantage of loans and direct investment from the advanced capitalist countries, coexisting with a huge peasantry subject to highly oppressive social relations at the hands of the landowners who dominate them. And therefore, capitalist development isn't kind of, as the bourgeois ideologists suggest, a kind of uniform levelling up of societies in which everyone kind of moves more or less simultaneously to higher levels of economic development. Capitalist development in much more involves this coexistence of advanced and backward economic and social forms within particular societies, and also to some extent on a global scale. Now, this is very important from a political point of view, because what this means, because on the whole, it's likely to be true that societies that are dominated by the coexistence of advanced and backward forms are likely to be highly unstable. again, go back to the case that Trotsky talks about. In Russia, beginning of the 20th century, you have two forms of class struggle that develop more or less simultaneously. You have the class struggle of the workers in the cities, places like St. Petersburg and Moscow, which represent, in many ways, the most advanced forms of workers' struggles that capitalism can, certainly at the time, can provide a context for. You have the struggle of the urban industrial worker coinciding within the same society and the same state with the elemental rebellion of peasants trying to seize the land away from the landowners. And this coincidence of different forms of class struggle is a key feature of the Russian revolutions, both of 1905 and 1917. And this makes the structures of such societies particularly liable to revolutionary upheaval. Now, I first read Trotsky's writings where he articulates this idea when I was a young revolutionary in the early 1970s. And I came from Southern Africa, from Zimbabwe, and was particularly interested in the struggle of South Africa. And when I read particularly Trotsky's great book, 1905, I thought immediately, he's writing about Russia, but he could be talking about Southern Africa. He could, exactly the same kind of combination of advanced and backward was characteristic of South Africa under apartheid. Highly advanced industries, reflecting the global development of the global process of capital accumulation, highly developed capitalist firms whose labour force was supplied by a system of migrant labour control, which reflected the way in which the African peoples of the area had been conquered and subject to the direct physical colonial power of the South African state. So Trotsky wasn't just making historic observations that are of historical interest. He was actually characterizing a feature that is chronically characteristic of capitalism in its whole process of development. And if I had time, I could talk to you about other examples where we have lost synchronicity of the non-synchronous. Here today, many societies. India is a fascinating example of exactly this kind of fusion of historical times as a result of uneven and combined development. Now, given these characteristics, it's very likely that in these societies, when people fight, the focus of those struggles, at least initially, are going to be around the question of democracy. This was true in Russia. Get rid of the Tsarist regime, end the autocracy of the Tsar, introduce minimal conditions of democratic political life. But this is something that has happened again and again in the history of societies that are subject to these processes of uneven and combined development. If we think about Egypt today, a society which reflects, I mean, you walk in the streets of Cairo, you see uneven combined development before your eyes. You see tremendous historical modernity coexisting with peasants in traditional dress, herding their sheep down a street where cars are driving along. The synchronicity of the non-synchronous is a visible reality in those kinds of situations. There also, until recently, you had an autocratic regime, and as in the case of many autocratic regimes these days, its political power underpinned by its alliance to the United States. In these kind of situations, mass struggles will tend to take the form, initially, of a struggle for democratic demands. In certain situations, we can see these democratic struggles as a particular form of bourgeois revolution, where we're talking about societies where pre-capitalist economic relations persist to a large extent. It's what was, and this was true in the countryside in Russia before the revolutions of 1905 and 1917, you can say that what we're seeing is the beginning of the bourgeois revolution. And this tempted many Marxists then and now to argue that one needed sharply to demarcate between two stages in the revolutionary process. An initial phase, which was that of bourgeois revolution, and a later stage of socialist revolution. And the duty of socialists in struggles in these countries was initially to do everything that they could to allow the bourgeois revolution to succeed, but to seek in different ways to contain the class struggle of workers themselves so that they wouldn't disrupt or prevent the success of the bourgeois revolution by, above all, threatening an alliance of different class forces that would stretch from workers and peasants on the one hand to the bourgeoisie, or in the case of colonized countries, the national bourgeoisie, at least partially oppressed by imperialism, and make the class struggle of workers for socialism wait for a second stage to develop. This was an argument that was very much alive in the Russian revolutionary movement in the lead up to the revolution of 1905 and 1917. It's still alive in sections of the left, particularly in the global south, where the influence of Stalinism has been especially great today, and it's an argument that Trotsky frontally challenged. And Trotsky argues that uneven and combined development scrambles together these apparently separate stages. And the critical reason why they scramble together is because of the formation within these societies of working classes that are sometimes highly concentrated and very militant. And what Trotsky argues is that the development of those workers' struggles will break through the barriers that separate the democratic and the socialist struggles, and that, in fact, attempts to hold those workers' struggles back, to adopt, as he puts it, a self-limiting audience, will actually undermine the democratic struggle itself, because workers aren't going to separate their opposition to an autocratic regime from their own social and economic demands. And the struggle against the autocratic regime will be that much more effective in as much as workers are fighting for their own social and economic demands, as well as against the autocratic regime. Now, I should say one thing. Although this whole argument is framed often in terms of a democratic struggle that is about carrying through a bourgeois revolution and a socialist struggle that is about getting rid of capitalism, I think that the fusion of democratic and socialist struggles is something that we can see happening even in societies where capitalism is dominant. In South Africa, for example, under apartheid, capitalism was dominant in South Africa. You know, it wasn't a question in fighting apartheid of carrying through a bourgeois revolution in South Africa. But the same kinds of arguments, whether you kept the two stages of the struggle separate, or whether or not the logic of worker struggles was to fuse together those different struggles in a logic of permanent revolution, a process of permanent revolution, came up in the struggle in South Africa. Now, some very brief points in conclusion. I'll just allude to a crucial point that Trotsky makes, which is the success. So, let me put it a different way. Trotsky is talking about how, in the conditions I've tried to describe, there's a tendency, as he puts it, for political to grow over into social revolution. But he also emphasizes that the social revolution will not be successful unless it goes beyond the national stage. What has made possible this growing together of political and social revolutions is the fact that capitalism is a globally integrated system. By that very fact, the socialist revolution can only succeed if it breaks beyond national borders and spreads. Now, We saw the logic of permanent revolution triumph in Russia in 1917. We can see that same logic at work in the Arab revolutions. The very important role played by Egyptian workers in striking the death blow to Mubarak, but so fighting around a key democratic issue, let's get rid of the bastard, and open a process of real democratization in Egypt. But you have a fusion of that kind of democratic struggle with the social and economic demands of the workers, they attempt to lift some of the unbearable pressure that neoliberal capitalism puts on the masses of Egypt off them. And that we can see the beginnings of a tendency for social revolution to emerge out of political revolution. But, and this is my final point, it's important to emphasize that there's absolutely nothing inevitable about political revolution growing over into social revolution. We have one great example of this happening, the Russian Revolution of October 1917. That's not because only in Russia did the kind of objective conditions that I've been describing come into existence. In fact, there have been lots and lots of other cases where those conditions came into existence, including in the Middle East, in Iraq, the Great Revolution between 58 and 63, or the Iranian Revolution between 1977 and the early 1980s. The difference that existed in Russia was that they existed in Russia, the Bolsheviks, a mass revolutionary party that was rooted in workers' struggles, and in the Soviets, the workers' councils, the Soviet councils, as they developed, but that developed a strategy for social revolution, for workers to take power for themselves. And therefore, we can identify the logic of permanent revolution at work in Egypt or Tunisia today. But for that logic to become a reality, the problem of agency has to be resolved. In other words, the Egyptian working class, the Tunisian working class, has to become a self-conscious political subject that poses for itself the question of political power. And for the working class in those countries to become self-conscious subject, they need parties that can articulate the consciousness that's required. So, in talking about the permanent revolution and the distinction between political and social revolutions, we're not engaged in a historical exercise. We're engaged in trying to understand better processes that are at work now that could begin to initiate not just a change of political regime, but a break with capitalism altogether.